If we based our knowledge of the Roman Empire on film and television, we might believe the entire civilization was one big love fest, engaging in adult activities when they weren't battling each other in the Colosseum or racing their chariots through the streets. But in ancient Rome, sex was a bit more nuanced than simple lustful parties full of hedonistic desires and seductive grape eating. For all the indulgent free love they are known for, it wasn't so groovy if you were lower class or happened to be a conquered people. In other words, sex in Rome is complicated. So, today we're dividing the facts and conquering the history of what sex was like in ancient Rome. But before we throw you to the loins, why don't you throw yourself at that subscribe button? Then race down to the comments and let us know what other steamy history you want to know about next. For now, when in Rome, do it as the Romans do. In ancient Rome, if you were homosexual, there was no impetus to keep it a secret. It was totally cool, as long as one adhered to a few social mores. First, you pretty much had to be a dude. And because men and women were of different social standing in ancient Rome, woman-on-woman relationships were frowned upon, unless a man was involved. Women weren't considered dominant in society. And back then, dominance was the name of the game. If a fella engaged in same-gender relations, they had to be the dominant partner in the relationship, lest they lose their social standing. It's just business. This allowed the men of Rome to freely engage with whomever they pleased, including slaves and working girls. As long as the lovemaking included a man, as a symbol of power, everything was fair game. The Stoics of Rome were kind of like the Vulcans from Star Trek. They were big on emotional restraint and did not jibe with sexual relations for the sake of pleasure. You could do the deed, sure, but only as an act of affection that bonded people together, thus keeping a stable family unit and a happy society. This is all a pretty long-winded way of saying they had no game. Stoics believed that lovemaking was often an unnecessary desire that clouded judgment and reason. Thus, they emphasized equality of all people, including slaves and women, so that the deed did not infringe upon the freedom or will of any individual. The pre-Republic Rome was a nation of scoundrels who used their vast power to take whatever they wanted, be it territory, treasures, or people. The most infamous example of Rome flaunting its unquestionable power was in 750 BCE, when Romans decided they needed a population boost. That meant bad news for everyone close by. These pre-empire pillagers abducted many women from neighboring Sabine tribes, specifically for procreation, resulting in the forced births of many babies. Now, assaulting a free-born woman could get an ancient Roman in a lot of trouble. However, the saying, "all's fair in love and war," seemed to be the motto of Roman soldiers when they were pillaging foreign lands. Soldiers were paid through plunder, which meant they could forfeit their currency to instead lay claim to anything found in conquered lands. We're talking about precious metals, delicious foods, priceless art, and people. It didn't matter if those people were free-born, because at that point, they were conquered and considered slaves. Romans were free to do with them whatever they wanted. If those captives were lucky, this meant being sold off for a tidy profit. If not, woof. Entertainers in ancient Rome weren't the superstars they are today. People like theater performers, chariot racers, and gladiators were near the bottom rung of society, second only to slaves. But the people went and saw them. Gladiator battles, in particular, were top-tier entertainment in Roman society, and as could be expected, the gladiators who fought them were heavily desirable. Many women and men tried to indulge in their fantasies by sleeping with these performers, from the lowly commoner to the wives of prominent figures. In other words, it's like show business today. These casual meetups between warrior and superfan had to be discreet, or influential people would risk someone uncovering the scandalous rendezvous. Take the case of Faustina the Younger, the wife of Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who would allegedly get real hot and bothered while watching gladiators beat the tar out of each other. Aurelius, at the end of his rope about the situation with his wife, consulted a soothsayer about what to do. The oracle suggested his wife go visit the gladiator, if you catch our drift, and she did. However, one caveat was introduced. The gladiator in question should be executed while lying on top of her, and Faustina should bathe in his blood afterwards. That is one intense oracle. Allegedly, this satisfied Faustina's wandering eye, allowing her and Marcus Aurelius to continue their marriage. Well, hopefully after a quick rinse in the basin. If you're a fan of locking lips, you can thank the Roman Empire for the privilege. The people of ancient Rome loved smooching so much that they spread kissing fever throughout the empire. And since Rome was the place to be, throughout the rest of the world too. Kissing in Rome was such a popular pastime, they even codified it into law and social custom. Roman men reportedly had an obsession with locking lips that developed into a full-on oral fixation. There were guidelines on how it should be done, who you should and should not kiss, and which circumstances warranted a wet smackaroo. Probably the most famous custom regarding ancient Rome and kissing is the passionate one done at a wedding ceremony, a tradition that carries on to this day. Roman couples weren't shy about bringing others into their marital beds for a little late-night lovemaking. Whether man or woman, nobody really cared as long as everyone had a good time. These acts were common in the marriage of Emperor Hadrian, but just on his side. His wife and second cousin, Vibia Sabina, was not clued into these sexual excursions, though she likely realized something was up when Hadrian eventually found a soulmate in a teenage boy named Antinous. Antinous eventually disappeared, and Hadrian did what any grief-stricken emperor would do. He had him declared a god and ordered him worshipped throughout the empire. Normal breakup stuff. Back in Rome, there were magical virgins with important placement in society. Vestal virgins tended to the temple of Vesta, the Roman goddess of hearth, home, and family. The 6 Vestals were chosen when they were between 6 and 10 years old, and were symbolic protectors of Rome's spiritual security under the eyes of the gods. Honestly, that doesn't sound like a bad gig. Except the post was served for 30 years, the entirety of which they had to remain virgins. The women were off-limits to all Roman men, with a small asterisk that read, "Unless you're the emperor." Elagabalus, for example, totally ignored this rule and married a Vestal in order to get divine children. All it gave him was a bad reputation with the gods. Good one, Elagabalus. With great power comes great responsibility. That is a nice sentiment when spoken by the doomed uncle of a burgeoning superhero. But when put to the test in ancient Rome, great power produced some of the most depraved acts ever imagined. Take Nero, for example. Can't hear enough crazy stories about the guy who put out a hit on his pregnant wife. However, he allegedly loved this late wife so much that when he found a young man who kind of looked like her, he ordered him turned into a eunuch so the two could be wed. This new bride was forced to dress in all the late Mrs. Nero's clothing. On the other end of the deviant scale, Caligula was known to steal women away from their husbands, while also finding the time to sleep with his own sisters. While incest wasn't super widespread, and it was frowned upon, it did exist in ancient Rome. It can be hard to separate facts from myth, but it is believed that those who could get away with it had the tendency to date closer to home. A lot closer. Caligula also threw adults-only parties where just about every lustful whim was indulged, which may be why his name has almost become a shorthand for extreme depravity. But the worst of the worst had to be Emperor Tiberius, who seemed to want the top spot on the Deviants Hall of Fame. We can't get into any detail here. Suffice it to say that even the youngest of the young weren't spared from Tiberius's appetites. Back in the ancient days, the Romans were looking for lovin' anywhere they could, so people selling themselves to get the deed done didn't really offend anyone's sensibilities too much. These workers ranged from slaves to freed women to high-class beauties, all working the streets of Rome. Rome made the whole thing official in 40 CE, officially taxing the profession of sex work and cementing the oldest profession's place as a legitimate business. Emperor Augustus even enacted laws banning any moral penalties for these workers, giving them a pass from Rome's strict moral code. Hey, work is work, even in ancient times. So what do you think? Was ancient Rome as debauched as you thought? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're there, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.